Hi, this is Stephanie from the Pasadena Public Library, and welcome to Knitting for Beginners. If you check the description below, I have a link to a PDF with basically everything I'm going to go over today, all laid out for you, so you can reference that later. So all you need to get started practicing is some worsted weight yarn, and I have size 7 or 4.5 millimeter straight knitting needles, but you could use a heavier weight yarn. You just want to go up in needle size if you do. So let's talk a little bit about yarn weight. That has to do with the thickness of the yarn, and your pattern will tell you which category of yarn weight you want to use. So the lightest would be lace weight, and then fingering, then baby or sport, then DK, which is double knitting, worsted or Aran, bulky or chunky, then super bulky as the heaviest. And these are the indicated needle sizes that you would use with them usually. So to start our knitting project, we'll cast on our first stitch using a slip knot. Nearly all cast on methods start with this slip knot. So I'm just creating a loop to start with, and then I'm going to turn this loop again to create kind of a pretzel shape. It'll look just like this, and then you can insert your needle under one side of that pretzel and pull both ends of your yarn to tighten that slip knot. So I'll show you that one more time. You'll notice that this knot is really easily tightened and loosened, which gives it elasticity. The slip knot is now considered our first cast-on stitch. One of the easiest methods of casting on is the thumb cast-on. It's not the most stretchy method, so be careful of pulling your stitches too tight. You're going to start by making a slip knot about 5 inches from the tail end, which I've already done here, and then you're going to hold the needle with the slip knot in your right hand and wrap the yarn around your thumb as shown. So I kind of grip the yarn with my fist, and then I wrap my thumb around it this way. Then insert the needle underneath your thumb and pull the stitch tight, but not too tight. So now we have 2 stitches cast on, and I'm going to continue until I've cast on my desired number of stitches. And generally, your pattern will tell you how many stitches to cast on. Because I'm just doing a little test swatch today, I'm going to cast on about 20 stitches. Now I want to show you an alternate method of casting on. This is called the long tail cast on, and it creates a relatively stretchy edge. Rather than having a short tail hanging off of our slip knot, we leave a long tail and we use it to cast on. So you're going to begin by pulling a long tail from the end of the working yarn. The amount depends on the number of stitches that you need to cast on. A good general rule is 1 inch per stitch in worsted weight. So I've left about a 20-inch tail and created my slip knot. Hold the needle in your right hand and allow the 2 tails to hang straight down. Place your index finger and thumb together and place them between the 2 tails. Grasp the 2 tails together in your fist. Then you open your index finger and thumb, separating the 2 strands of yarn. This is your starting position. Now bring the right needle tip up under the closest strand of yarn, which loops around your thumb. Bring the right needle tip over and down through the loop on the index finger. Then bring the right needle tip down through the loop created by the thumb. Drop the loop off the thumb and onto the right needle. 1 stitch has been cast on. tighten that stitch, and let's look at that one more time. So we're back on our starting position, and we go under the thumb, down through the index, back through the thumb, pull it tight. Under the thumb, down through the index finger, down through the thumb loop, off the thumb, pull it tight. While this method might seem complicated at first, it does actually cast on quite quickly with practice. Once I've cast on the desired number of stitches, I'm just going to turn this needle so that it's in my left hand and the working yarn is off to the right. Now let's talk about how to hold our yarn. So in English style of knitting, you wrap your yarn around the fingers on your right hand. So here is just one method of doing it. This is the method that I use. I wrap it around my ring finger, then it goes over and around my other fingers. This is what works for me. It's what allows me to produce even tension on my yarn without hurting my fingers. So I'll show you one more time. I just wrap it around my ring finger, I go under my middle finger, and then over and around my index finger. And then I hold my needle just like this. So I'll show you a different method of doing this. You wrap it around your pinky, then you go under your ring, over the middle, and then under your index finger, and it'll look like this. Personally, I'm never able to get the right amount of tension when I hold my yarn like this, so it's not the method that I use. Now let's learn how to do a knit stitch. Now insert that needle from left to right through that first stitch, and you can wrap your yarn around your hand as you plan to hold it later, or you can just start by holding the yarn in between your index finger and thumb, whatever works for you at the moment. Then you're going to wrap that yarn around your right needle. So we're going to go around the back of the right needle and then down in between the needles, like this. Now, while keeping tension on the wrapped yarn, bring the tip of the right hand needle with its wrap of yarn through that loop on the left hand needle. And then you'll slide the right hand needle towards the right until the first stitch on the left hand needle drops off. You've now formed a stitch on the right hand needle. Okay, we'll repeat that again. Insert the needle from left to right. Wrap the yarn. Then have that right needle go down through the loop and pull the stitch off the end of the left needle. Then we'll do it again. Wrap the yarn through the loop and off the end. So I'm just going to do this all the way across this whole row. And once I've knitted all the stitches on this row, I am just going to flip my work over to the other side, and I'm going to hold this needle in my left hand. Now I'm just going to work on my second row here, and I'm going to repeat just knitting every stitch on this row. So the second most important stitch to learn is the purl stitch. So after knitting every stitch on every row for about 10 rows, this is what it looks like. And now I'm going to do a purl stitch. And for this, I want to have my yarn in front of my work, and I'm going to insert the needle from right to left. Then I'm going to wrap my yarn around the right needle. And then I'm going to pull that right needle down and through that first stitch, and then pull the stitch off the end of the needle. So remember, with your purl stitch, you always want the yarn to be in front of your needles. Then insert the right needle from right to left through the next stitch. You're going to take that yarn, there we go, from right to left. Then we're going to wrap the yarn around the needle, pull the right needle down and back through that loop there, and then pull the stitch off the left needle, and then we formed another purl stitch on our right needle. So just keep going in this manner. So the knit stitch and the purl stitch are basically opposites of each other. When you knit a knit stitch, it looks like a little V, and on the back side, a knit stitch will look like a little bump. And the purl stitch is just the opposite. So when you knit a purl stitch, it'll look like a little bump, and on its back side, it'll look like a little V. Okay, so I am just going to purl all the way across this row to the end, and when I flip over, I am going to do a knit stitch. And when you use a stitch pattern where you, on the right side of your work, knit every row, and on the wrong side of your work, purl every row, that is called the stockinette stitch. So I'm just going to go back and forth. I'm going to do a bunch of rows where I knit on the right side of the work and then flip over and purl on the wrong side of the work. And I'll show you what that looks like once it's knit up. So now I've knit about 14 rows, and you can see the stitch pattern really clearly. So from the right side of the work, you can see all these little V's, which are creating this stockinette pattern. And if I flip it over, you will see the bumps. And the bumps are what the wrong side of stockinette looks like. So usually this is on the inside of your project. And at the bottom here, you can see where I have created a garter stitch. So a garter stitch looks like a series of ridged horizontal rows, and that is what happens when you knit every row on the right side and wrong side. And it's nice in that it is really easy to do, and it looks the same from the front and the back. So you can kind of see, if I pull it apart, there are rows of knit V's in between rows of purl bumps. So there are all kinds of stitch patterns that you can create with just the knit and purl stitch. I'm going to show you ribbing. So for this, I'm going to knit a stitch, and then I'm going to purl a stitch. And before I can switch over to purl, I don't want to stitch it just yet. First, I want to take my yarn and pull it in between my needles so that is in front of my work, in front of my needles, just like this. And then we're ready to knit a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl, and my next stitch is going to be a knit stitch. So I'll take my yarn back in between my needles, and I'll have it at the back of my work. And now I'm ready to do a knit stitch. So I'm going to continue like this all the way across, going back and forth between knitting and purling. When I reach the end of that first row of ribbing, I will flip over the work, and if the last stitch you did on the previous row was a knit stitch, then you'll do a purl stitch. If the last stitch you did on the previous row was a purl stitch, then you'll start with a knit stitch. So I'm starting with a purl, and I can tell when I'm supposed to knit because the stitch on my left hand needle will look like a V, and I can tell when I'm supposed to purl because the stitch on my left hand needle will look like a bump. So I'm just doing the same thing I did with my first row, alternating between knitting and purling. So here's what it looks like after I've knit about 10 rows, and you can see I have knit stitches with purl stitches in between, which creates this kind of vertical stripe. It's very stretchy. Ribbing is really good for cuffs or waistbands, neckbands, hats. It's also really good for scarves because it looks the same from the front and the back. Now let's talk about how to do an increase. There are a number of ways of increasing the number of stitches on a row, and each has their particular uses. First, let's do a make one increase. You can either do a make one left or a make one right. So first I'm just going to knit a stitch. First let's do a make one right, which leans to the right. So first I'm just going to knit a stitch, and then you see I have a bar that runs in between my stitches here. So it's this bar right here. And I'm going to lift that up onto my left needle. So my left needle will go from back to front underneath that bar and lift it onto the left needle like this. So I'll show you that one more time. We'll go back to front through that bar. And now it's up on my needle. Now I'm going to knit that stitch through the front, just like you would normally knit. It can be a little bit tight. There we go. I'm just going to knit the next stitch. And when I get to the end here, I'll show you the make one left. The make one left is similar, but we're going to go from front to back, lifting up that bar, and then we're going to knit through the back loop. So I'll show you again. You just go from front to back, lifting that bar, then insert your right needle through the back of that stitch. It can be a little bit tight again. Then we're going to knit that, and then I'm just going to knit the next stitch. So now you can see I have 6 stitches because I did 2 increases. Now let's talk about how to do decreases. So decreases reduce the number of stitches on a row, and again there are several methods of achieving this. I'm going to show you how to do a knit 2 together, and then I'll show you how to do a slip slip knit. I'm just going to knit this first stitch. Now I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches as if they were one stitch. So I just insert my needle as if to knit and knit them as one. So I'll show you that again. We just go basically treat them as if they were a single stitch and knit them together. The result is one less stitch on our row, and the decreased stitch is leaning to the right. Now let's look at the slip-slip knit. For this, you're just going to insert your right needle as if to knit into the next stitch, but then just slide it off onto the right needle. Now do that with the next stitch. We just slip it. And now take your left needle and you're going to insert it from left to right through those 2 stitches on our right needle. You're going to wrap your yarn around the right needle and go ahead and pull that loop through, and that is called knitting through the back loop. So again, we slip, slip, take our left needle through those 2 stitches that we slipped, and we're going to knit those 2 together through the back. The slip-slip knit stitch is going to result in one less stitch on the row and a left-leaning decrease stitch. The last thing we need to learn how to do is to bind off. A bind off is a method of finishing your last row so you can remove the project from the knitting needles and it won't unravel. There are many different methods of doing this, each with their own benefits. So here's one of the simplest methods of binding off. Knit the first 2 stitches on your last row. Then insert the left-hand needle into the rightmost stitch. Pass the stitch over the left stitch and off the needle. Knit the next stitch on the left-hand needle, insert the left-hand needle into the right stitch, and pass the stitch over the left stitch and off the needle. Then repeat this until only 1 stitch remains. When only 1 stitch remains, trim your working thread so you leave about a 6-inch tail. Take that last stitch off your needle and put your thread tail through the last stitch to secure it. Our last step is to just weave in our ends using a plastic yarn thread. I'm just going to thread my little tail here through a bunch of stitches on the back of my work. After weaving in 3 to 4 inches, it's okay to trim off the excess. And you're done. So when you first start looking at knitting patterns, immediately you will notice that they are written in shorthand. So you'll see a lot of abbreviations like these listed here. These are just a few of them. It's good to check your pattern. Sometimes they have a little glossary explaining what some of the shorthand is. So anytime you come across some shorthand that you don't recognize, check your pattern's glossary, and if you don't find it there, then I would go look it up online. So in the description below, I link to some beginner-friendly knitting patterns. I recommend choosing something that doesn't have any increases or decreases when you first start out, so you can just practice casting on and doing knit and purl stitches. Okay, so let's look at a beginner-friendly knitting pattern. This beginner stitch sampler scarf is a free pattern and it's pretty beginner-friendly. you'll usually see on your pattern, it'll tell you what weight of yarn to use. So right here it's telling me that I need worsted weight wool blend yarn, and then you'll need your yardage, so 350 yards of worsted weight wool yarn. So if I know that the yarn that I want to use comes in 200 yard lengths, then I'll have to buy 2 of those to make this scarf. So it'll also give you your needle size. So this is a size US 8 needles, and it'll tell you how many stitches to cast on to start. Often knitting patterns are written like this, sort of in shorthand, so row 1 we knit 30, and then this is repeated until the section measures 6 inches. So your pattern may tell you to repeat a certain pattern until it measures a certain number of inches, or it might tell you to do a certain number of rows, or it may say repeat rows 1 through 5 8 times. So there's different ways of doing it. Here we see a stockinette section. So this RS means right side, so that means on the right side we're knitting every stitch, and on the wrong side, the WS, this is the pattern. So you knit the first 3, you purl all the way across, and then knit the last 3. And that is creating that garter stitch edge, which keeps the stockinette stitch from curling. And yeah, you just basically follow the pattern here. So K7 would mean knit 7, then purl 4, knit 4, purl 4, knit 4, purl 4, knit 3. So I think it's pretty easy to follow. And then at the end here, it's telling you to wet block using blocking wires or straight pins to ensure a straight, non-rolled edge. So I will talk a little bit about that as well. So gauge has to do with the number of stitches and rows in a usually 4-inch section. So in order for our finished project to come out the right size, we need to make sure we have the correct gauge. So usually your pattern will have a gauge, and it'll list that at the beginning of the pattern. As an example, this one was 16 stitches and 24 rows for a 4-inch square. Using the same yarn and needles that you're planning on using for your project, cast on more stitches, usually about 6 more stitches than is required by the gauge. The reason we cast on extra stitches is because the edges tend to be a little distorted, so we don't want to count those. Then you're going to knit enough rows, so if your gauge tells you you need 24 rows, you're going to knit about 30. So once you've done that, you can bind off and you can measure your swatch. So in this example, I would measure a 4-inch section across and count how many stitches are there. So if you had 16 stitches, you would know that you were knitting the correct gauge. If, on the other hand, you got maybe 17 or 18 stitches per 4-inch section, that would mean that you are knitting tighter than the pattern indicates, so you might want to go up in needle size. If you get fewer stitches in a 4-inch square, say you got 14 or 15 stitches instead, that means you tend to knit more loosely, and you might want to go down in needle size to help you correct that. I also like to make note of how many rows I have in that 4-inch square. So if I was supposed to get 24, but I instead got, say, 23, that might tell me that I may need fewer rows than the pattern tells me to get the same size. So you might be tempted to skip making the gauge swatch and just go straight into knitting your pattern, and you may find when you've done that your finished piece is way off in terms of the size that it was supposed to be. And that's because, your gauge being off by just a 1/4 inch on a 4-inch square, that gets multiplied as you knit the entire piece, and it ends up being, too big or too small by many inches. The last step in your knitting project is blocking. This is a really vital step which will really improve the look of your knitting project. So first you'll want to get your project wet. You can either hand wash it or just steam it, and then you're going to lay out your project on a flat surface. You can buy a knitter's block. They're basically these big foam mats, or you can just use some towels, anything that you're able to pin your item to. Then you're going to pin the edges flat and try to match your desired dimensions. Try to arrange your project in the finished dimensions that are listed in the pattern. So say if you were doing a sweater and you knew that the waist was supposed to be about 20 inches across at the bottom, you would stretch it into that position and then pin it in that position and let it air dry. And once it dries in that position, it will have a nicer shape. Okay, I hope this has been helpful to you and you're able to get in some practice. I have listed in the description below a few easy knitting projects to get you started. They only have knit and purl stitches and no increases or decreases, so they're a really good way to just practice the basics. Happy knitting!